good to go. I want to welcome those who are joining us from online. We are studying the book of Job for the Moorhead Church of Christ, Wednesday evening Bible study. We are going to begin Job chapter 14. And certainly this is a book that requires study. It's a book that we can take a lot of good material out of here to really help us to understand life. And certainly from the perspective of Job, we're taught about a man who is enduring great suffering and not really understanding why. So Job becomes that example for us of a man that sort of patiently endured suffering and overcame. I want to look at just a summary of chapter 13. In chapter 13, Job denounces his three friends as lacking wise and sufficient counsel, and then he turns his attention away from them and really directs his attention directly to God to plead his case to him, to get him to sort of understand that he is an innocent man. That being said, we're going to turn our attention tonight to chapter 14, and Ernest, would you like to read verses 1 through 6, please?
Man that is born of a woman is of a few days, and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower, and is cut down, and flee also as a shadow, and continueth not. And do thou open thine eyes upon such a one, and bringest me into judgment with thee. Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? Not one. Seeing his days are determined, the number of his months are with thee. Thou hast appointed his bounds that he cannot pass. Turn from him, that he may rest till he shall accomplish, as a hireling his day.
Okay. So looking at this, of course, Job is still responding. He's responding now to God. And he is still, if you think about the situation idea, sort of pleading his case, making his case. He is trying to make a case, but he's not in God's court. But this is the case that he's trying to make, and he's trying to make it to God, to get God to sort of explain to him why he is going through all of this suffering, and explain to him that he hasn't done anything sort of deserving of the suffering that he's encountering. So he begins in chapter 14 by saying in verse 1, man who is born of woman is short-lived and full of turmoil. And he seems to be drawing together the idea of sort of mankind in general. He mentions three phrases. He says he's born of woman. The idea is sort of the idea that human, the idea that we're talking about humans here. The fact number 2 here that the lifespan of a human on earth, of course, is brief. And then third, from Job's current mindset with regard to his suffering, that man's life is full of turmoil. That's why I said from his perspective, because when we look at a broader perspective, well, life isn't necessarily full of turmoil. And here the idea of, there's no peace or tranquility or disorder and things like that. But you got to remember that Job is speaking in the midst of great suffering. And from his perspective, he's sort of focused to that end. And we recognize here, as he talks about things here, that our eternal existence really is beyond this life. So when we think about age, and we think about 100 years old, I mean, that seems to be pretty impressive. But when we look into eternity, I mean, what is 100 years? It's nothing. It's relatively nothing in terms of eternity. When he talks about, full of turmoil, he's sort of the viewpoint, the idea that man's life seems to be constant things going on, constant confusion and disorder and sort of the lack of peace in his life. But we know, again, from a larger experience in life that, life also has those joys, those things that are enjoyable about it. And really, a lot of times our lives are what we make of them. If we look at that perspective, you're going to see people that are really always discouraged, and they always are sort of fixated on all their problems. But if we step back from a situation, is life just isn't that way where it is all one side or the other. Somewhere in between is where life is. There's some days there are things that happen in life that we wish that wouldn't have happened, but there are many, life is filled with many joys along the way. And so we must kind of put that together and to recognize that. But Job, again, sort of recognizing that man's life is sort of full of trouble and things like that. And when we see it from the perspective he's at, then we can understand it. Otherwise, we get the idea that he's just sort of saying life is bad news. Well, before all this happened to him, would he have said the same thing? Would he have made the same declaration before all of this suffering came upon him? Well, he probably wouldn't. He probably wouldn't say it was one or the other, but he certainly wouldn't mention it in the way they did. Any questions about verse 1? Verse 2, Job continues, like a flower, he's talking about man. He comes forth and withers. He also flees like a shadow and does not remain. Now, Job is illustrating what he said in verse 1 when he talks about life being short-lived. He uses two similes, making comparison. We see the words like or as. You're comparing two different things to sort of show a common quality. And so first of all, he talks about a flower. A flower is a beautiful thing, and people plant flowers all the time. Why? Because they want the plant, but they're looking forward to the flower. But when the flower comes, the flower doesn't stay around long before it essentially goes into sort of decay and sort of shrivels up. It's a beautiful plant. We see flowering plants, they're very beautiful, but the idea is that appearance of the flower is a short time, it withers and dies. Then he says man is like a shadow, and so we know a shadow is like a temporary phenomenon that occurs when light rays are blocked, and once the light is, as full light is restored, the shadow disappears. And so he's sort of making that comparison. Man's life seems to be very short, and it's short like a flower or like a shadow. So we move on to verse 3. He says, thou also dost open thine eyes and bring him into judgment with thyself. And so talking about God, Job seems to wonder why God would judge a man in light of his frailty. In other words, since he is so, sort of frail, and, he's not here on life very long and all these things, why even bother? Because he's just here for a short time. And Job tries to make sense of sort of God's ways, and sometimes from a human perspective, God's ways don't always make sense from our perspective. Not that our perspective is correct and God's is incorrect, but from our perspective, sometimes we don't understand things. Here's Job sort of wondering about why God even sort of bothers to deal with judging humans when their lifespan is so short. In verse 4, Job continues, said, who can make the clean out of the unclean? And he says, no one. And we look at the situation and we recognize that Job is talking about man in terms of his sort of his ethical placement in life. The idea is whether he is a just man, if he is a sort of a righteous man, or if he is a wicked man. And back in Job chapter 1 and verse 1, the very first verse of this book says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. So the idea is that Job is really a clean man, but here he feels as though the idea is God is sort of being, with his judgment, the idea is that maybe he's being too strict with his judgment, because when God looks down upon humanity, the idea is that man has all the same problem. God is perfect in terms of his righteousness, but man is imperfect in that. And that being the case, the idea is how are you going to find, how are you going to be able to find the clean, out of the clean when you see all the sort of the failings, of mankind? Job hasn't done any evil that he hasn't repented of and offered the appropriate sacrifice. So this is a struggle for Job as he thinks about these things, and he really is, from God's perspective, a clean, he is a righteous and holy man. And Job is just sort of wondering why God is sort of expecting sort of the frailty of humanity, expecting perfection from man, when the idea is that man can never be perfect like God. Okay, any questions about verse 4? Verse 5, Job continues. He says, about man, since his days are determined, the numbers of his months is with thee, and his limits thou hast set, so as that he cannot pass. Okay, what is this verse telling us about man, that Job sort of reveals about man?
Death is inevitable.
Okay.
And you can't change it.
Okay, so death, in other words, man only really has a period of time, and that he's going to dwell on earth, and then he's going to die. Psalm 90 verse 10 says, as for the days of our life, Moses writes this, they contain 70 years, or if due to strength 80 years, yet their pride is but labor and sorrow, for soon it is gone and we fly away. And so the idea is we have an appointed time. Some live shorter lives, some live longer lives, but I mean the idea that there's an appointed time for man to live, each person to live, and then their life is over. Why? Because God has determined this. God has sovereignty, the idea of his unlimited power and control over his creation. And so the years that we live really are determined by God. And once our time is up, then our time is up. And it really, again, shows us sort of really the humility that we as mankind and we know as Christians should have. The idea that God is so over all things, we depend upon him. He has a set time for our lives, and we depend upon him for everything that we need to exist. And it really sort of brings about sort of a humbleness to recognize that we live really on God's earth, and he is in control of it all. Any questions or comments about verse 5? Okay, if not, let's go on as Job continues his speech. He says, turn thy gaze from him, talking about man, that he may rest until he fulfills his day like a hired man. So we're looking at this verse and we're trying to understand here what exactly Job is advocating here, verse 6. What's that?
I guess not to, asking God not to allow so much suffering.
Okay.
Is that it?
Well, it's on that. It's sort of one of that thing. The idea is that if God is sort of scrutinizing his creation, scrutinizing man, and man is frail and things like that, maybe God should just sort of let man alone. And he really seems to be talking from his own predicament. In other words, he's the one that's suffering, and he's going through all this. And if God would sort of leave him alone, and that is here the word rest in the New American Standard. The Hebrew word means to cease or leave off, and it means to cease from being troubled. If God would sort of pull back from the suffering that he's allowing Job to go through, then Job could essentially just fill out the rest of those days and his time would be over. And, a lot of times when we're looking at Job's, what he's saying, that he seems to be, critical of God, when I think if we were in his shoes, we'd have probably a little bit different perspective. In other words, if all you have is question marks, you're grasping for anything you can try to figure out. Imagine not knowing the simplest of things and trying to have to find out some way what you're missing. You're missing something you don't understand. So the idea is God has some kind of part in it because he's your creator, but you don't really understand the connection. And so all of these thoughts are going in your head as you're trying to reconcile what is going on in your life. All right. We're going to move on to the next section here in verses 7 through 12. And I'm going to ask Jenna if you would mind reading that for us.
Okay. For there is hope for a tree when it is cut down, that it will sprout again, and its shoots will not fail. Though its roots grow old in the ground, and its stump dies in the dry soil, at the scent of water it will flourish and put forth forth sprigs like a plant. But man dies and lies prostrate. Man expires, and where is he? As water evaporates from the sea, and the river becomes parched and dried up, so man lies down and does not rise, until the heavens be no more. He will not awake, nor be aroused out of his sleep.
Okay, so is Job giving us just a mere lesson of forestry here, or what?
He's
But-
pretty down.
What are you thinking? What's that?
Comparing his life to a tree, or a life to a tree.
Okay, so you're getting it. He's sort of making a comparison here, you know, and this is again from a modern perspective. An ancient perspective is so different. We would never really talk about this. Plus, they added the idea of it's poetry. So we're talking about this book is in Hebrew poetry. We would never talk really in the terms there. So when we're studying books like this, you know, we really have to take ourselves out of that mindset, because sometimes we're sort of like, why don't you just say it? Why don't you just? And he is, but in the perspective, in a different time, this would be acceptable way to talk to me. This would be, people would understand what you're saying. It would make perfectly good sense. And really, we wouldn't understand that probably unless, you know, people from our time maybe talked with somebody then, and they probably wondered why we're talking the way that we talk, you know, because they just do things differently in ancient times and modern times. So he's really trying to make a point here, as Jenna has mentioned here. The idea is that, you know, if you cut a tree down, is it dead? It might be dead, okay? I mean, that's a pretty significant thing. You can't start, if somebody comes and you have a tree and you cut it down, you're thinking, well, it doesn't look so good for the tree. However, the point is that, you know, the tree has a chance to sprout again. It has the opportunity to recover and put out a shoot. And if it puts out a shoot, the idea is it sort of comes back to life. The idea is we've seen that even when they've, you know, on the boulevards, when the city comes by and cuts trees, and, you know, they leave them there for whatever time, they've got to grind the stumps out. Oh, you see all these things. That tree isn't dead. It actually is producing life in it. And if you leave it and you water it, yeah, it's going to look kind of crazy, but essentially you're going to have a tree. It's going to recover from even a catastrophically sort of being cut off. And his point here is that, you know, the tree has the possibility to recover, but for a man who dies, Job is saying there's no possibility for him to come back to life. That is, there's no resurrection. So this sometimes causes us some difficulty when we look at this and we're like, well, wait a minute, Job. I mean, Paul's going to talk about, Jesus is going to talk about resurrection in Matthew 5, 28 and 29, about the general resurrection. He's going to talk about it in John chapter 11, where he talks about I am the resurrection and life. He talks about that, and then Paul's going to talk about it in 1 Corinthians 15. So how do we make that go with what Job is saying here? How do we reconcile the fact that Job is essentially saying, you know, a tree has a possibility of coming back, but if a man dies, he's not coming back. See, it's something to make you think, huh? Okay, what we have to do is to recognize that Job lived in an early time in terms of biblical revelation. So some believe that this may have been written about the time that Moses perhaps was the author of this book, but it is essentially somewhere in the line of those first few books of the Bible. And it predates really the book of Exodus, because he is not under the patriarchal age. There's no, you know, Abraham yet. There's no the 12 tribes. None of that's going on. So we're talking sort of in the Genesis time frame. And here's Job, even though there's no mention of him. And we don't really have, when we look at the book of Genesis, we have nothing written down. We have a basic moral code. And what we see, even throughout the rest of the Old Testament, is that they had a vague understanding about what happens when you went into the afterlife, okay? So the resurrection of man was not understood in the Old Testament. They understood that when one died, they went to Sheol, And Job has now mentioned this twice already about Sheol. Sheol is the Old Testament equivalent to the word Hades in the New Testament, the place of disembodied spirits. It is the underworld, the abode of the dead. And we also know that in the Old Testament, on one occasion, that Elijah raised the widow of Zarephath, her son, after he died, back to life. 1 Kings 17 through 23. But that is after the time of Job. And even at that, we were talking about this sort of one resurrection, that this was such an exception to the rule that people had really no idea of this full concept of the doctrine of the resurrection. And this really doesn't come to light until Christ comes and we hear about what he can do.
So basically, Job said that trees had a better chance than a human.
Right. So, because he knows that when you die, you're going to go to Sheol. That's the underworld. That's the place where the dead go. They're going to be alive. And there's going to be, like Hades, the place where the righteous are, the place of the wicked. But we're talking about a resurrection. So in other words, he's saying once you die, you're not coming back from being 6 feet under. You're there. You're not coming back. The tree is going to come back, but if a person dies, they're not coming back. And this sort of causes a difficulty because we know what the New Testament says, and what we recognize is he doesn't have, as like those in the Old Testament, a full understanding about the resurrection. And see, even when Jesus is introducing this, it was the let me think about this. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. And so we think, well, that's pretty late to not believe in something like that. But that becomes something is not understood well. Even Paul is talking about that in 1 Corinthians 15, where people have no understand about that. It is not really known more fully until we have more revelation. And so that's really why Job is sort of he doesn't have any understanding. And that's why he's making the claims that he is. And that's why when we use the book of Job to sort of, doctrinally, we have to be really careful, because we can end up with some stuff that may not have the complete picture of revelation, whether his friends are speaking, he's speaking, or if somebody denominationally wants to use it to make a point about something, it may fit whatever their theology is, but it may not fit in with the whole of what Scripture teaches about that particular doctrine, because they didn't have all the information at that time to make the right assessment. So that's in essence what he's saying is a tree dies, it can come back if you, it can sprout, it can grow, but with man, that's just not going to be the case. Verse 8, though its roots grow old, that's the tree stump in the ground, and the stump dies in the dry soil, verse 9, at the scent of water it will flourish and put forth sprigs like a plant. And so once a tree is cut down, we kind of automatically assume the tree is dead. And you know what? If it doesn't get any water, and if it's left and it dries long, if you get a lot of heat, maybe it will die. But once you start giving it water, there's a good chance that it's going to put out sprigs or small branches, and it will continue to be alive as long as it has the essential elements that it needs for its survival. Okay, any questions about those couple verses? Okay, Job continues verse 10, but it makes his point again here, but man dies and lies prostrate. Man expires where he is. And so the idea here is that Job, in a man's lot in Job's eyes, is hopeless. Once he expires or breathes his last, sort of he dies, he lays prostrate forever, that's the end. He's just going to decay, and he has no chance of coming back. And that's where he sort of concludes the matter. Verse 11, Job says, as water evaporates from the sea and a river becomes parched and dried up. And so here he uses another simile about when a man dies. It's like the water in a sea or a river that is all dried up, never to return. And we're not really talking a full sea, but apparently pockets that would be witness the idea of pockets coming by the river, so forth, the idea of drying up, and the idea is they don't fill up with water, and sort of that is compared to sort of man's lot. Jameson, Faust, and Brown, their commentary on Job and talking about as the waters fail from the sea and the flood decayeth and dryeth up, says, sea, that is a lake or pool formed by the outspreading of a river. And it says here that Job lived near the Euphrates, and the sea is applied to it. Verse 12, Job says, so man lies down and does not rise, until the heavens be no more, he will not awake, nor be aroused of his sleep. And so this is, in some ways, from Job's, this is the idea, is there's man really doesn't have any hope. You know, once you, as far as being back alive like the tree, the idea is once you die, it's over. You go into this place, and it's this murky underworld. You know, it's there's questions about what happens there. So when I looked up Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary and talking about Sheol, it talks about it being a shadowy, gloomy. This is the perspective of ancient people in the Old Testament. Shadowy, gloomy, where disembodied souls had a conscious but dull and inactive in existence. And so there just really wasn't a lot known about it, because how would you know? I mean, nobody comes back from there. You die and that's it. You don't have revelation from God. You could sort of see where they get this real vague understanding about the place. They would know that you have about God and the idea of importance of being obedient to God, as Noah did, and talking about he was a righteous man, and of course the world was full of sin. The idea that people would die, they would go somewhere. There's a place, it's this place called Sheol, and there's that place, of course, it would be a place where the righteous are going to be rewarded and the wicked are going to be punished. So in verse 12 again, he says, so man lies down and does not rise up until the heavens be no more. He will not awake nor be aroused out of sleep. The heavens here, from the Hebrew word, means visible heaven, sky, where the stars are. And it is doubtful that Job is now revealing the belief of a bodily resurrection, as some suppose maybe meets with 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. Until the heavens be no more is a difficult phrase to interpret, because it seems to be suggesting sort of the idea is he'll be resurrected, you know, once the heavens, you know, sort of the seen world, the created world will be destroyed. So it's a difficult phrase to interpret, considering what Job has already said. He said that when a man dies, he's dead. He goes to Sheol, and that's it. He does not come to life again in this realm. So probably the meaning here is more that the one who dies never sees the heavens again in this realm. I mean, that just seems to be more fitting. So sometimes we get in situations where the words can lead us to sort of believe something, but when we fit it with what we've been studying, it sort of goes against what. So the idea is we sort of say, you know, this word probably is not meaning, you know, the idea that all of a sudden he might be coming up with a change of heart or something. So unless there's any questions, we're going to go into 13 through 17. So Ryan, do you want to read 13 through 17?
Oh, that thou wouldst hide me in Sheol, that thou wouldst conceal me until thy wrath returns to thee, that thou wouldst set a limit for me and remember me. If a man dies, will he live again? All the days of my struggle I will wait until my change comes. Thou wilt call, and I will answer thee. Thou wilt long for the work of thy hands, for now thou dost number my steps. Thou dost not observe my sin. My transgression is sealed up in a bag, and thou dost wrap up my iniquity.
All right. So again, we're taking in the words of Job and trying to really process everything, what he's saying here. He said in verse 13 again, oh, that thou wouldst hide me in Sheol, that thou wouldst conceal me until thy wrath returns to thee, that thou wouldst set a limit for me and remember me. So again, Job is talking from his great suffering, and he believes that it's God's wrath. Now, he doesn't know why God's angry with him because he's declaring his innocence, but yet God is angry. In his perspective, the idea is God is angry. I'm not sure why. I'm declaring my innocence. I don't know of anything that is really what would be considered an outstanding sin for which I haven't repented of and offer the acceptable sacrifice. This word wrath figuratively is specific of God's anger. And we want to look at another verse in the Old Testament, Jeremiah chapter 30. And this is going to be similar here. Now we know it's a different author, but it's interesting sort of the similarities that this verse has to what Job just said. Jeremiah chapter 30. And we want to look at verse 24. So Jeremiah 30 and verse 24. Ernest, do you have that by chance?
Yes.
Okay, you want to read that for us, please?
The fierce anger of the Lord shall not return until he have done it, and until he have performed the intents of his heart. In the latter days he shall consider it.
Okay. So here we have an example. Of course, Jeremiah is dealing with Israel. He's dealing with God's people. The idea that when God's people left the way of righteousness, when they become unfaithful to the covenant, God sends prophets trying to call them back, say, listen, you don't want to go down this road. You are disobeying me. You need to repent. If you don't, you've tied my hands. Really, all there's going to be is wrath. And the idea is God is going to, once God unleashes his wrath, it is going to be unleashed until it is fully accomplished everything that God has said. So when God deals with his people, a lot of times, he lets them fall into the hands of his enemies for however long, to whatever extent, until he has accomplished really the judgment that he set out to accomplish here. So what request does Job have of God? We go back to Job chapter 14 verse 13. What request does Job have of God, since he is suffering God's unrelenting wrath on earth? This is Job's perspective. What request does Job have of God, since he is suffering God's unrelenting wrath on earth?
Basically sounds like he wants to be dead.
Okay, it sounds like he wants, because he talks about, if you would hide me in Sheol. If I leave this earth, I'm going to leave my body. My body is being afflicted greatly. I'm in lots of pain. I've got the boils. I've got the oozing. I'm itching from that. And the idea is my body is in a decaying state. But if I die, I can escape really that suffering. I can go there, and all of my troubles really be out of the way. I won't have to suffer anymore. And I liked what Denny Petrillo said in his book of Job's World Video Bible School. In this verse, he says, God's wrath is like an animal seeking its prey. That wrath could not find its prey, so it returned to God. It could not find its prey, that is Job, because he is hiding in Sheol. And so in other words, he's going to be able to escape it. God is essentially going to accomplish that. If he dies, the wrath, he won't be here really on this realm to take any more of God's wrath. Now remember, he doesn't hate God. As much as Job has suffered, he's not angry with God. He doesn't hate God. He does not have any desire to turn away from God. What he wants to do is to get things back to before all of this happened. He wants things to be the way they were before all of this happened. And so he makes this statement here in verse 13, that thou wouldst set a limit for me and remember me. And the limit that Job wants God to set is the time he is in Sheol. In other words, I will go there and you can fulfill your wrath until the end. I'll go there for that time, and I'll remain there till your wrath is concerning me is over. And at that point, Job says that he wants God to remember him, which suggests release from Sheol. But then what? is Job, hoping for something that he doesn't understand? Is he now sort of hoping for a bodily resurrection for which he has no understanding about? When we look at that incident in Genesis 22, where Abraham takes his son up to the mountain to sacrifice him, and of course we see that Abraham is going to do exactly what God wants him. In fact, he's sort of being restrained at some point when he's going to get ready to plunge the knife into his son. When we get to the book of Hebrews, we see that the Hebrew writer gives us more information about Abraham. And the information is that Abraham believed in God so much that he was going to give him the son, and through this son, he was going to be the father of nations. He believed that so much that he believed that if he would have killed Isaac, God would have had to resurrect him from the dead, even though he'd never seen it before. And so, are we thinking about something like Abraham? The idea is Abraham had never really understood that. He lived in the same era, as Job. And is Job sort of thinking, well, maybe you could bring me back. Maybe there's a possibility. You're the God that made the heavens and the earth. Maybe you could just sort of bring me back. In other words, he doesn't really have the revelation of God, but the idea is he's supposing this. The idea that maybe after all of God's wrath is you could bring me back in a bodily resurrection. Okay, any questions about verse 13? Verse 14, if a man dies, will he live again? All the days of my struggle I will wait until my change comes. So Job has already declared that that death sort of is, as far as a resurrection, bodily resurrection is impossible in verses 10 and 12. He says, all the days of my struggle, I will wait until my change comes. And the struggle here, the Hebrew word, Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English lexicon, means of hard service of a troubled life. He talks about waiting until my change comes. And the word change here, the Hebrew word here, means revival after death, under figurative of relief from military service. So the idea that revival after death, okay? So it might be that while Job has no revelation from God concerning a bodily resurrection, that he holds out hope that when he is vindicated before God in his courtroom, he might experience his bodily resurrection. Sometimes it's very hard to sort of follow what Job is trying to say, and the idea that even though he doesn't believe in sort of the idea that he could hold out hope, and the idea is well, God could make something like this happen if he wanted to. And so that's sort of the challenge of really interpreting the scriptures before us here. Don Shackelford, in his Truth for Today commentary on the book of Job, says, quote, even though Job had dismissed the possibility of a bodily resurrection, he came back to the thought of it. Returned to life, Job would have left his old diseased body and be given a body full of vitality, unquote. Verse 15, Job says, thou wilt call and I will answer thee. Thou wilt long for the work of thy hands. And so Job has a hope here. Job has been saying many things about God. Again, the idea is he doesn't want to get rid of God. And like I said, this is sort of things for us to hold on to when we think about Christians sometimes that never even come close to the suffering of Job, and yet God has sort of been thrown behind them, and they've left God and done whatever. But the idea is Job again sort of wants to get back to that point he was with God before all this happens. Job wants to call out to God, and if God called out to Job, Job said he would eagerly reply. Job wants God's fellowship, and he believes that God can sort of restore sort of that lost relationship that came about when he began to go through all of the sufferings. Job wants God to long for him when he sort of talks about, wilt thou long for the work of thy hands? The idea is, will you long for me? Okay? Any questions about verse 15? Verse 16, Job says, for thou For now thou dost number my steps, thou dost not observe my sin. The steps here, the Hebrew word, Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew lexicon, Hebrew English lexicon means in figurative of the course of life. So you number sort of my steps or the course of life. And so Job says to God, you have seen all that I have done in my life. In other words, my life's sort of an open book. You've seen all that I've done from the time that I sort of came onto this realm to the point I'm at now. But God, you know that I have not done anything for which I am sort of justly suffering. The idea is there's no sin, there's nothing I've done that essentially has not sort of been taken care of. And so I am not guilty of sin. And sort of the idea is you know that I'm not guilty of sin. And you think about Job as being a righteous man. He's not sort of trying to just sort of say, well, I've lived most of my life for God, and I think I should be able to catch a break every once in a while and be able to sin here and there. But the idea is he is so certain about his standing before God that he's convinced that God cannot lay out a case for him that he has sinned, that there's an outstanding sin. But he wants to know why God is sort of punishing me, if you will, with the suffering for having done nothing wrong. Okay? Verse 17, Job continues, says, my transgression is sealed up in a bag, and thou dost wrap up my iniquity. And this is, again, sort of another tricky verse for us to deal with. The word transgression, according to Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary, has to do with a violation of a law, command, or duty. And it usually sort of entails the idea of revolt or rebellion. The word iniquity from Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary sort of is defined as unrighteousness or lawlessness, and is often used to describe evil and wickedness. Denny Petrillo, in his book of Job for World Video Bible School, says about this verse, he says, Job has consistently maintained there is no sin in his life to have warranted this punishment. So, to wish for forgiveness here is inconsistent. Job seems to believe that perhaps God is punishing him for a lifetime of sin which he had previously been overlooked. And this is sort of what Denny sort of believes is happening here. It's hard to sort of follow, sort of, is that the exactness of what Job is saying? Is there something that Job forgot about? Some things that are overlooked, and now all of a sudden, okay, all of those things, God's collected all of them and said, okay, now you're going to get punished because of these things. Okay? Any questions about that or any comments? Okay. Let's go for the last few verses there, 18 through 22. And I think, Jen, you had a chance to read, didn't you?
Yeah, I can read again.
You want to read it? Okay. You want to read 18 through 22?
But the falling mountain crumbles away, and the rock moves away from its place. Water wears away stones, its torrents wash away the dust of the earth. So thou dost destroy man's hope. Thou dost forever overpower him, and he departs. Thou dost change his appearance and send him away. His sons achieve honor, but he does not know it. Or they become insignificant, but he does not perceive it. But his body pains him, and he mourns only for himself.
Okay, so here we sort of have another sort of thought that Job is presenting here in these last few verses. Again, in verse 18, Job says, but the falling mountain crumbles away, and the rock moves from its place. Water wears away stones, its torrents wash away the dust of the earth, so thou dost destroy man's hope. And so this is sort of an illustration, the idea that a mountain is very tall at one point, and mountains usually are tall for, but over time you can sort of see them eroding. Things, they sort of crumble, and the idea from the weather and from the elements, the idea is that, parts of the mountain break off and roll off and essentially roll down the mountain, and it sort of illustrates the fact that the forces of nature, as they work against that mountain without stopping, Job sort of sees a similarity in terms of what has happened here between him and God. And so Job sees his life here being destroyed by the suffering that God is continually to sort of put upon him, and that his suffering is going to continue to the death without hope that will stop. He sees himself in sort of the same sort of light as that, which is very, you sort of think, well, that seems pretty dark. I mean, the idea that you sort of think those thoughts, but he is just, like I said, a man with lots of questions and no answers. And so just as the suffering came without explanation, the idea that now it's here, it doesn't seem like it's going to go away. And the idea is I don't have any hope. I mean, this is what it seems like. It's been going on this long, and there doesn't seem like anything, hope is not in sight. Going on to verse 20, Job continues, says, thou dost forever overpower him, about man here, and he departs. Thou dost change his appearance and send him away. And so this was kind of a tricky one to kind of work through too. So I look at other versions of the Bible, and I thought the Amplified Bible really presented this in a little different way and sort of added a little bit more to it. The Amplified Bible reads, you prevail forever against him, and he passes on. You change his appearance in death and send him away from the presence of the living. So kind of getting all those things together and kind of looking at that, Job confesses God's sovereignty. God will do what he will do. God has allowed Job to suffer greatly, and in time, Job is just destined to go to the grave, and that's really how it's going to end for him. Okay, any questions, comments about that? Verse 21, his sons achieve honor, but he does not know it, or they become insignificant, but he does not perceive it. So Job is sort of putting himself in sort of man, the idea that man is allowed, sort of God overpowers him, the idea that God does these things to man, and then he sort of, he goes from the presence of the living. And what he's talking about is really the aftermath. Once you depart from this world, how much are you going to know when you're in the next realm about what's going on in this realm? Okay, so you don't have any knowledge, and this is very similar to what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 9 verse 5. He says, for the living know they will die, but the dead do not know anything. It's not that they're dumb and they're just not intelligent, but the idea is they don't know what's going on in this realm. In other words, all the news about this realm stops the day that you go over into the afterlife. All you know are going to be the things that you knew while you were on earth, but you're not going to know about all the goings on that has continued on since you have departed from the world. So for the living know that they will die, but the dead do not know anything, nor have they any longer a reward, for their memory is forgotten in time. The idea is you're going to be forgotten. And if you go out to a cemetery, who remembers the people in those plots in the cemetery? Relatives, friends. What happens when they die?
Exactly.
And what happens after, after a while, you're just a name on a stone. Nobody knows you. Okay? So when a man dies, he does not know in Sheol what's going on earth. Now I'm using the Bible because it'd be Hades. Okay? Job says about one who is dead, for example, he will not know what will become of his sons, assuming he has sons, and that's what's being assumed here, whether they will achieve honor really among the people, or their lives don't amount to very much at all. I mean, he won't know. They'll be gone. The idea that I'm going to be removed from this realm. And that's sort of what happens in death. The idea that everything is sort of left behind. You go there, sort of life carries on. And then the last verse, verse 22, says, Job says, but his body pains him and he mourns only for himself. And so this creates problems when you study this, trying to think about, well, if he's talking about being in Sheol, well, there's no pains of the body. You don't have a body. You're a disembodied spirit. So we're having trouble really sort of placing his words. He only mourns for himself. it seems to be the idea that he's really talking about being on this realm, and he might be just switching gears back to the idea of, possibly another interpretation is that if he's still alive and he is, if a man is going through great suffering, he's going to be sort of detached from the progress of his sons because he's going to be so focused on his own suffering, and that's sort of the interpretations that you're left with. And I thought Barnes did a good job. Barnes notes the book of Job. He says, quote, "The idea of Job is that it would leave all the comforts of this life. It would be separate from family and friends. It would go lonely and sad to the land of shades and of night. Job dreaded it. He loved life, and in the future world, as it was presented to his view, there was nothing to charm and attract. There he expected to wander in darkness and sadness, and from the gloomy world, he expected to return no more forever." And then Barnes mentions another commentator, name is Eichhorn. He says, however, has rendered this verse so as to give a different signification, which may perhaps be the true one. So the idea is commentators are really all over the page, trying to really understand what Job is trying to say. All that being said, there's just a couple quick applications, and the idea is sometimes when we're reading through this, we're thinking, well, what can we really pull from this? And I guess before I play my hand, I'll see if there's anything that you really stand out that from chapter 14, you think, there's, as Christians today, what was something that, couple things maybe we could think about that we can pull from this book?
Well, life is short, and
Okay, that was one of the ones I had.
Yeah.
The idea that life is short. And think about it, the idea is if life is short, it's important that you live it right. The world is not focused on life is short. If you meet the average 20-year-old or 20-something person, how often do they think, my life is really short. I better be a responsible person, better make sure my spiritual house is in order, because you know what? Anything can happen, and I want to be ready for God. They think they're going to live to be whatever old is, 60, 65, 70, whatever it is. They're making a great assumption that I'll be around to see all of this time. And the constant reminder is how often do we hear on the news that some 20-year-old something got killed in a motorcycle accident or a rollover in a car or something like that. And the idea is life is short. And Job really teaches by his character. Obviously, he's struggling through this, but we know he's a righteous man. And he knows life is short. How is he living his life? He's living his life as a righteous man. Okay? What's another thing? There's at least one more that I think that we can pull out from there that I may have somewhat let the cat out of the bag. Life is short. What else?
He's conscious of the afterlife.
Okay, that was the other one. The idea that there's an afterlife. And as a Christian, that's not that scary. If you're a Christian, you're a faithful Christian, that's not scary. We ought to be comfortable with that idea. It's not about it shouldn't be this big scary thing. The idea is it's really about changing addresses. I'm going to go from this address, I'm going to get a new address. If I'm walking with Jesus the whole time, I'm going to go through a different door. Yeah, it's going to be different, but it's going to be okay. But the idea is that there's an afterlife. A Christian prepares for that. That's the difference between the Christian and the world. The world either wants to forget there's an afterlife, deny that that's a reality, or automatically assumes that without any preparation and their own declaration of goodness, that they are going to be able to walk in there and everything's going to be okay with God. So it really sort of helps put life in perspective. We shouldn't be overly invested in this world because everything that we accomplish or accumulate in this world is going to be left behind. All that we take forward, and this comes from the New Testament, all that we take forth or we send ahead are really those deeds that we've done, those that we're not sort of making investments in things that moth can destroy or steal, but the idea that we're sending them ahead. And so I think those are at least two things that sort of help us to recognize, we're right where we should be. We will not have any regrets if we stay right where we are now. We'll only regret that if we make a decision to turn our backs on God and really join with the rest of the world in rebellion against God. Okay, any questions or comments? Or?
I had a question.
Sure.
Do you know how old Job is during all this?
Yeah, I think those are excellent questions, and it's pure speculation. You know, he has old enough to have 10 kids, be married and have 10 kids.
I think you asked that one before.
I asked something.
Yeah, those are good questions. The Bible doesn't say, yeah, and that's kind of what we're left with, just pure speculation. So I want to thank those
People
who've
have
joined
kids
us.
early, maybe around like getting married 15, 16. So
Oh.
I always put Joe around like 38, 40.
Yeah.
Somewhere around there.
They got married really young. So I think the average girl was 12 or 13, and the average man,
Maybe.
a Jewish perspective, sort of, I think it's upward of between 16 and 22. So then you think, well, 10 kids, how many years, you know, so we're just sort of speculating. Anyway, I want to thank those who joined us to watch the video. Hope it will be uplifting to you, and hopefully you'll be able to watch another one. God bless you.